this is Megan Hanks from UMBC's Office of Communications. Today I'm here with Dr. Lee Blaney, Associate Professor of Environmental Engineering, to talk about his work supporting the Chesapeake Bay.
Hey Megan,
Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. So can you tell us a little bit about the challenges that face the Chesapeake Bay that you're trying to address?
Yeah, so one of the challenges that we're really interested in is looking at nutrient loading into the Chesapeake Bay. So these nutrients can come from cities and towns. So basically the wastewater that goes down our drains has some nutrients in it, or it can come from agriculture. So both animal feeding operations as well as food crops. We can see nutrients run off into the bay. And so this is definitely a cause of concern for us, because as we start loading nutrients into the bay, what we can do is actually spur algal growth. And as those algae grow up and eventually die, they decompose and they kind of consume some of the dissolved oxygen that's in the water of the bay. So this is a big issue because just like us, crabs and fish also need oxygen. And so if we pulled all the oxygen out of the water, those crabs and fish aren't going to be happy and will die. It's a little bit dark, but that's what happens. And so this is a big issue in the Chesapeake Bay. Last year, this process caused a dead zone to form. So a dead zone is basically an area with low dissolved oxygen content that was roughly the size of 3 million Olympic-sized swimming pools. So we're talking about a lot of habitat in the Chesapeake Bay being lost to these nutrient issues. It's not only limited to the Chesapeake Bay. Every year, the Gulf of Mexico has a big dead zone that occurs from all the nutrients kind of washing down the Mississippi River. That dead zone last year was about the size of New Jersey. And so these are very big problems. These are very grand challenges. And this is one of the ones that we're kind of facing in the Chesapeake Bay.
Great. So you kind of touched on this a little bit, but why is this something that needs to be addressed?
First is really environmental quality. So the Chesapeake Bay, is very important, especially in this area. And so protecting that ecosystem, the more we can reduce the size of dead zones, the better. It's going to give more habitat for some of the species that we hold near and dear here in Maryland, fish, crabs, everything else. And so we want to reduce the size of those dead zones. But we can also take a number of notes from other places in the country. So Lake Erie is one place that comes to mind. Obviously a big source of fresh water in the country, especially in the coming decades with water shortages and things like this. But a few years ago, there was a big algal bloom in Lake Erie that was caused by nutrient loading. And one thing that can happen with some of these algal blooms is that we can also produce harmful bacteria. And so there's one class of bacteria called cyanobacteria that produce harmful toxins called cyanotoxins. And so this was actually a big issue in Lake Erie because Toledo, Ohio gets their water from Lake Erie. And so there's high levels of these cyanotoxins in the water, and that actually shut down the drinking water supply for Toledo for 3 days.
Wow, it's a huge impact.
It's a huge impact, especially for a city of like 400,000 people.
Right.
What would you do without water for 3 days?
3 days, right, that's a long time.
And so, there's definitely the environmental quality side of things, but there's also public health side of things. We want to make sure that we have clean water, both to use recreationally, but then also to drink. And then there's a number of other important drivers. So one of the nutrients that we're interested in is phosphorus. There's very few phosphorus reserves around the world. Actually, 75% of the world's phosphorus is kind of stored in Morocco and its territory, Western Sahara.
Wow.
So one country kind of really has the monopoly on natural phosphorus supplies. And so when we think about some of the work that we're doing, looking at trying to recover these nutrients, so not just preventing them from getting into the water, but actually recovering them and being able to use them for useful purposes. This is really important because the world's population is increasing exponentially, and all of those people need to eat food, and we need nutrients like phosphorus to grow that food. And so you can imagine if one country controls 75% of the world's phosphorus, this kind of raises like some very serious questions about food security, about political security, economic security. And so if there's ways that we can kind of think about this waste management process from a resource recovery process, maybe this is something that not only helps Maryland, but also helps the world.
Absolutely. So you used poultry litter in your lab. So tell me about how poultry litter is related to the abundance of phosphorus that is found in the Chesapeake Bay.
Yep. So I should mention first that phosphorus in the bay comes from a number of sources. The two main ones are really urban areas, so cities and towns, everything that goes down our drain ultimately goes into the environment. And so we ourselves are a source of phosphorus, and then agriculture as well, and that can come from animal manure. It can also come from runoff of fertilizers that we apply to grow crops. And so one of the reasons that we're interested in poultry litter is because Maryland is a huge producer of poultry. The eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay is actually one of the densest areas of poultry production in the whole country.
Wow.
There's actually 600 million birds that are produced every year
Oh my gosh.
on the Delmarva Peninsula.
Wow, I did
So
not know that.
you can imagine that 600 million birds produce a lot of poultry litter.
Exactly. Right.
And so one of the things that we're trying to do is say, how can we take this potential liability, how can we take this potential source of pollution into the bay, and then, like I said before, spin that around rather than a waste management issue, actually turn it into a resource recovery issue. And so that's one of the main reasons that we're interested specifically in the poultry industry. But I will stress that these nutrient issues really extend across a number of different areas of industry.
Absolutely. So you mentioned before that nitrogen and phosphorus are what you're focusing on. So are there other nutrients that are found in abundance in the Chesapeake Bay?
There are, but in terms of some of those negative environmental outcomes that we talked about, nitrogen and phosphorus are the two main ones of concern. In general, what you oftentimes see is that in coastal water systems, nitrogen is the limiting nutrient for some of these algal blooms. And so kind of like the more nitrogen that you put into that water body, the more severe the environmental outcomes would be. For inland bodies of water, phosphorus tends to be limiting. The Chesapeake Bay is a little bit unique. Both nutrients are actually quite important, and they're both major components of something called the Chesapeake Bay Total Maximum Daily Load. This is kind of a tool that we use, a blueprint that we use to reduce nutrient loading into the bay. Some people call it a pollution diet. So kind of like, how can we restrict, how can we reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus going into the bay over time so that we can make sure that the health of the bay remains strong. And so those two are going to be our main drivers. Another nutrient that is of interest to us is potassium. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, those are really the three key nutrients that we look at in fertilizer products for growing food crops.
Great. So how do you use poultry litter to recover this phosphorus in your lab and the nitrogen? How do you do it?
Yeah, so we have two technologies that we've been developing. The first one we call PAIRS, the Phosphorus Extraction and Recovery System. The second one we call NERDS, Nutrient Extraction and Recovery Devices. So a good acronym goes a long way, we think.
Right. I like
and so
it.
we're excited about both PAIRS and NERDS. The PAIRS process is the furthest along right now. And so this one I think is really cool because we have poultry litter, which is a waste, and then we actually use another waste stream to generate valuable resources. And so that other waste stream in this case is CO2. So people hear a lot about CO2 in terms of climate change and flue gas and all of this stuff. So one of the things that we're trying to do is like, can we take that CO2 and actually use that to help extract nutrients out of the poultry litter?
Okay.
And so what we do is we take our poultry litter, not the poultry litter coming from 600 million birds right now, but from a couple dozen birds. We throw that into water, and then we bubble CO2 through it. And so this could be something that if we're located near a place that's generating CO2 as a waste stream, we can kind of divert that straight through our process, take advantage of that waste CO2.
Absolutely.
So as that CO2 kind of bubbles into the solution, we're able to extract those nutrients. And then we do a little bit of applied chemistry and we produce products. And so those products, we produce two main ones. So one is called struvite. It's kind of one magnesium, one nitrogen, and one phosphorus.
Okay.
And then another product is called potassium struvite. It's one magnesium with one potassium with one phosphorus.
Okay.
And so the nice thing about these two products is rather than having kind of off ratios or unbalanced ratios of these key nutrients, we have in struvite one nitrogen to one phosphorus. And in potassium struvite, we have one potassium to one phosphorus.
Okay.
And so this is really great because it gives us control over those fertilizers. So we can mix these together. We can get different nitrogen to phosphorus to potassium ratios. which is going to benefit us for using that product on different types of crops. The NERDS process we're also really excited about. It's a little bit more in the scientific phase right now. We're kind of exploring some of the deep science of it, but it's a brand new paradigm. It's a brand new framework for thinking about how to recover nutrients from waste streams. And so we're thinking about applying that one to municipal wastewater, agricultural waste, source separated urine. So we're really kind of exploring all of the waste streams here and saying how can we get the most out of this waste before we discharge it. Not only to prevent the environmental outcomes, but also to hopefully generate products that we can sell and make a profit.
Right, absolutely. So how does this process benefit farmers who have all this waste?
So I think both of these processes will benefit farmers in Maryland quite substantially. So Maryland is a little bit ahead of the rest of the country with respect to nutrient regulations. Like I mentioned before, we have very dense poultry operations on the Eastern Shore, and so a couple of years ago, Maryland kind of came up with a new law called the Phosphorus Management Tool. Doesn't sound like a law, but it is a law. And so what this does is two main things. It regulates regular testing of agricultural soils, and so when we look at the chemistry of those soils, we can get a sense of, can the soil kind of accept more phosphorus or not?
Okay.
And if the answer is no, that kind of gives the indication that that phosphorus won't get bound into the soil and will potentially run off and get straight back into the bay, which we don't want to do.
Right.
And so when the soil is actually saturated with phosphorus, one thing that will happen is that this law basically prohibits farmers then from applying any additional fertilizers on that field. And this is where it gets interesting because poultry litter is actually considered a fertilizer because it has all these nutrients in it.
Interesting.
So the initial expectation was that about 1 in 5 farmers would be affected by this regulation.
Wow, that's huge.
Which is quite significant.
That's huge.
So if you think about 20% of farmers on the Eastern Shore, 20% of the poultry industry, like this is a big impact.
Big deal, yeah.
And so what's happening right now for those farmers is they actually have to physically transport this poultry litter off-site.
Wow.
And so you can imagine that if you have to truck out tons and tons of poultry litter, that's going to be very expensive.
Absolutely.
Both in terms of actual dollars, but then also in terms of energy.
Right.
And so one way that our technologies will benefit farmers is by taking the nutrients out of the waste product. We can take whatever's left over, so those kind of low nutrient poultry litter solids, we can put those on fields. They'll still be beneficial soil amendments. They contain organic carbon. They contain some other trace elements. And so that will still be beneficial for those agricultural soils, but we won't be applying the nutrients.
Right.
At the same time, we're also generating these nice products, which we can sell. And like I said, phosphorus reserves are dwindling. They're located in just a couple of places. And so the cost of phosphorus is going up. Since the early 2000s, the cost of phosphorus has gone up about 3 times already.
Wow.
And so that's going to continue into the future. And so if we're kind of looking at building poultry litter processing into an alternative supply of phosphorus, this is also potentially a lucrative market.
Absolutely.
For poultry farmers in Maryland.
Wow. So once the phosphorus is removed from the poultry litter, how is that leftover solid used?
Yep. So what we want to do in this case is kind of take those low nutrient or nutrient deficient solids and apply those straight to a field. So the idea for us in this case is partially a soil amendment, but really just more from a waste management perspective. So if we're thinking about kind of transporting these to a landfill or transporting these to some other place, again, it's going to be a lot of energy costs, as well as just the actual transportation costs itself. And so for the byproducts that come out of this process, those will be, able to be directly applied to fields. And then the products, like I said, we would want to sell those off. But preferentially, we'd want to sell those off into farms or other operations that are outside of the Chesapeake Bay because we have enough nitrogen and phosphorus in the Chesapeake Bay, and we don't need more, so we can give it to someone else that does need it.
Awesome. So you talked about how this will impact farmers, but how will this impact the entire state of Maryland?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think one of the big things that we face a lot in this work is kind of the long-lasting tensions between the environmental groups and agricultural industries. And so we actually see this work as something that helps bridge that kind of classic divide between maybe like polluters and environmentalists or something like that. And so by reclassifying waste management as resource recovery, I think we kind of help everyone win. You know, in terms of some of the negative environmental outcomes, we're preventing nutrients from getting into the bay, and so that's a win. From an agricultural perspective, you know, we're kind of handling some of these waste issues that are now regulated under the phosphorus management tool. So we're helping farmers deal with these things. And really, at the end of the day, we think that our process will save them money. And again, both in terms of dollars and energy, which is increasingly expensive and important in the world. And so I think in terms of you know, both Maryland as well as the rest of the country, this kind of reclassification of waste management will have really big impacts on how we kind of do a lot of different types of business, actually.
So what are the next steps for you in your lab?
Yeah, so for us, the next step, what we really want to do is get the Pears technology out onto a farm.
Wow.
So we have plenty of farms out on the Eastern Shore, and we're really looking forward to finding a good partner and saying, let's build out, you know, a pilot on farm.
Wow.
Let's start processing much more poultry litter, generating much more of these fertilizer products that we can then sell off. And I think, you know, with these new regulations, I'm hoping that we'll be able to find some good partners and kind of build out this pilot project, get a better sense of what the economic plan could look like, the business plan could look like, and then hopefully start getting Pears reactors on more and more farms to keep ensuring the quality of the Chesapeake Bay, generating an alternative supply of phosphorus, and growing new markets and economies in the state of Maryland.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.